People ask me why I didn't fire. They ask it gently, the way historians ask questions when they already suspect the answer doesn't fit neatly into a. They ask it in lecture halls and debriefs and quiet offices with the kind of careful phrasing that means they are not really asking about doctrine at all. They are asking about something older, something that does not have a clean name in any of the fleet's operational codes. I tell them what I told the inquiry board. I tell them the Vahari remnant was not a threat. Not because they lacked weapons, they had weapons. Antique and failing and barely capable of scratching the outer hull of a second-tier picket vessel. But weapons nonetheless. And not because there were too few of them to matter. There were 11 ships. 11 ships and somewhere between 40 and 60,000 people, and every one of those people was the last of something. That is why I didn't fire. I was standing on the bridge of the carrier Meridian Constant when they arrived. We were running a standard in-atmosphere patrol rotation, 800 meters above the Karen Basin, the city below us just beginning its morning shift. The light rail lines, bright orange threads across, the grid, the coastal desalinization towers catching the early sun. It was a quiet morning. We had been on heightened readiness for 11 days, ever since the deep array stations at the outer transit corridor logged an approach signature that didn't match anything in current registration. It matched something else. Something the Kethavan archive had been cross-referencing for the better part of a century. The Vahari, I knew the history. Every captain at my rank knew it, because the history was part of our operational briefing package, and had been since the archive protocol went active. 55,000 years ago, a civilization called the Vahari had occupied this region of space. They had not occupied Earth. Earth had been of little interest to them, a quiet world on the edge of their survey range, noted in their records as a minor biological reserve with no resource value. They had looked at us once, decided we were not worth the administrative effort, and moved on. 55,000 years ago, something had struck their home system. We did not know what. The archive had pieced together fragments, gravitational anomaly records, debris trajectories, the faint chemical signatures of a civilization's end, scattered across 17 light-years of cold space. Whatever had happened to the Vahari, it had been total. Their primary worlds were gone, their colony infrastructure gone, their fleet scattered into the dark in fragments, fleeing on whatever heading had enough fuel behind it. Some of them had fled toward us. They had been traveling, or drifting, hiding in the long dark between stars, for 55,000 years. The ships that dropped from transit above the Karen Basin were old in a way that nothing in our fleet was old. The hull plating was mismatched, paired 10,000 times over with whatever material the next generation of survivors had managed to scavenge. The drive signatures were inconsistent. Some ships burning old reaction chemistry, some running something we couldn't identify, something improvised out of components that no longer had original names. The formation they held was not a military formation. It was a refugee column, 11 ships strung out across 200 kilometers. The smaller vessels tucked in close to the larger ones, the way small animals press against something warm. They broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, which told me their communication systems were fragmented enough that they weren't certain which bands we still monitored. The message was in Old Vahari, which the archive translation subsystem rendered into standard in approximately 4 seconds. It was not a demand for surrender exactly. It was something older than a demand. It was a claim. He said, this world was near the boundary of Vahari sovereign space. They said they were returning to their territory after a long absence. They said they expected to be received as the legitimate heirs of the civilization that had once held this region. And they asked, not ordered, to be permitted to land and begin the process of reclamation. I stood at the forward rail of the bridge and looked at the sensor feed for a long time. Tactical officer had a firing solution in under 30 seconds. Of course she did. That is what tactical officers do. She was very good at hers. And the solution was clean. 11 ships. The yield calibrates precisely enough that the debris pattern would clear the upper atmosphere in under 6 hours, with no surface impact. The city below us would have seen nothing more than a brief light show at the edge of the sky. She presented it to me, and I read it. and I told her to stand down and hold it. "Captain," she said, not a question, not a challenge, just a word with a weight behind it. "Hold it," I said. "Open the archive relay." The Kethavan archive had been under continuous operation for 212 years. It was not a monument. I want to be precise about that. Because the word monument implies something static, something built to be looked at. The archive was a working instrument. It had spent 2 centuries cataloging everything humanity had been able to recover about the Vahari, their language, their biology, their social structures, their territorial records, their last known fleet deployments, the fragments of their communication traffic that had reached us in the millennia since their collapse. It had also, quietly and without announcement, built a mercy protocol, a package of information to be transmitted to any returning Vahari survivor fleet in the event that one ever found its way back. Whoever had commissioned that protocol had understood something I think about often. They had understood that if the Vahari ever came back, they would come back as people who had spent 55,000 years believing that they coming home to something. They would come back, carrying a grief they did not yet know they were carrying. Protocol was not designed to threaten them. It was designed to tell them the truth gently enough that the truth did not destroy what was left of them. I authorized the relay. The archive package went out on the same broadband spread the Vahari had used, because we wanted to be certain they received it in full. It took 17 minutes for their fleet to process it. I watched the sensor feed. The 11 ships held their positions. 2 of the smaller vessels drifted slightly out of formation, corrected, held again. Their drive signatures fluctuated. Power being redirected. Or perhaps simply the trembling of very old machinery in the hands of people receiving news that rewrites everything they have believed for longer than human civilization has existed. The archive had told them, as gently as it could, that the Vahari sovereign space they were returning to no longer existed, that the worlds at its center were gone. That humanity had been observing slow dissolution of Vahari territory for 20,000 years, tracking the collapse of their infrastructure, finding the dead outposts and the silent stations and the ships that had run out of fuel and gone dark in the long empty stretches between stars. That of the Vahari civilization that had once held this region, these 11 ships, these 40 to 60,000 people, were, as best the archive could determine, all that remained. They were not coming home. They had not had a home for 55,000 years. They had been carrying the idea of one. The reply came in fragmented Vahari, and the translation took longer this time, because the syntax was disorganized in a way that suggested the person speaking was not composing carefully. They asked one question. They asked whether the archive was certain. I answered personally. I told them the archive had been built precisely because we wanted to be certain. I told them that the people who built it had hoped, at the end of 2 centuries of work, that the answer would be different. I told them the answer was not different, and I was sorry. There was a silence that lasted a long time. Then the fleet's lead ship, the largest, the one with the most mismatched plating, the one that had clearly been repaired by hands that were born and died and were born again across centuries of transit, transmitted a final message. They asked what we intended to do with them. The Mercy Protocol had an answer for that too: land, rest. There was room, and there had been room prepared. Because the people who built the archive had understood that this conversation would happen someday, and had thought carefully about what the right answer was. Not as conquerors, not as the heirs of a territorial claim that no longer had a territory behind it, simply as the last of something, which deserved the dignity of not ending alone in the dark between stars. The Vahari fleet entered landing approach, in a column, the same formation they had held through transit, and the meridian constant shadowed them down and watched them set their ancient, exhausted ships onto the plain north of the Karen Basin, in the long amber light of a morning that was turning into afternoon. I stood at the forward rail and watched them land, and thought about the people who had spent 200 years building an archive, so that this moment would not end badly. 55,000 years is a long time to carry something home. The least we could do was be ready when they arrived.